The Collectors Part 1. The 18th Empire Supreme Overlord Krathos stood upon the command deck of the Void Render, his flagship and the crown jewel of the Nexarian Star Dominion's war machine. Through the reinforced viewing portal, he gazed upon what should have been the culmination of his life's ambition, the subjugation of the final holdout world in this sector of the galaxy. Earth hung in the void like a marble of swirled blue and white, utterly defenseless. No orbital platforms, no defensive grids, no fleets rising to meet his arrival. Just a single, lonely planet spinning peacefully around its yellow star, as if unaware that death had come calling. Magnificent, isn't it, my lord? General Vextar approached, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the bridge's crimson lighting. After 60 years of their insolent silence, we finally have them cornered. Krathos nodded, his 6 eyes never leaving the planet below. The Nexarian Dominion had conquered 437 worlds, enslaved countless species, and carved out an empire spanning 8 star systems. Yet this one primitive world had consistently ignored every ultimatum, every show of force, every demand for submission. They simply existed, carried on with their mundane lives as if the mighty Nexarian fleet was nothing more than a minor weather disturbance. Their silence ends today, Krathos rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. Prepare, the planet crackers. We'll give them one final chance to surrender, then turn their world into an asteroid field. Communications officer Zixal looked up from her station, antennae twitching with uncertainty. My lord, we're receiving an incoming transmission from the planet's surface. Excellent. Put them through. Let's hear their pathetic pleas for mercy. The main display flickered to life, revealing not a terrified government official or cowering military leader, but an elderly human male sitting behind what appeared to be a simple wooden counter. Behind him, shelves lined with various containers and packages suggested some sort of commercial establishment. The human wore a faded green apron over casual clothing and was methodically polishing a glass with a cloth. Oh, hello there, the human said cheerfully, looking up from his work with the same expression one might use to greet a neighbor. I'm Tobias Henley. I run the corner market here in downtown Portland. You must be the folks from the... He glanced at a handwritten note taped to his register. Nexarian Star Dominion. Sorry for the delay in getting back to you. We've been meaning to respond to your messages, but you know how it is. Busy season, and all. Krathos felt his mandibles twitch in disbelief. You run a market? Oh yes, 43 years now. Family business, you know. My grandfather started it, then my father, and now me. We specialize in imported goods, though lately we've been branching out into more exotic items. Tobias smiled pleasantly. Can I interest you in anything? We just got a shipment of Andromedan honey crystals, absolutely divine on morning toast. I am Supreme Overlord Krathos. The alien leader's voice boomed across the bridge. Commander of the greatest military force this galaxy has ever seen. I have conquered hundreds of worlds and crushed civilizations under my heel. I offer you one chance to surrender before I reduce your pathetic planet to cosmic dust. Tobias nodded politely, as if listening to a customer explain their grocery needs. That's nice, dear. Sounds like you've had quite the adventure. How many years have you been at it? Years, Krathos sputtered. I have spent decades building this empire, entire lifetimes devoted to... Oh, decades, Tobias interrupted with genuine enthusiasm. That's impressive dedication, though I have to say, you're actually our 18th. The bridge fell silent, except for the hum of the ship's systems. Even the normally chattering Nexarian crew had gone quiet. 18th... What? Krathos whispered. Galactic Empire, of course, Tobias said, consulting his handwritten note again. Let's see. First were the Corvathians back in 64. Lovely folks. Terrible fashion sense. They taught us about quantum mechanics, though they called it reality, sculpting. After them came the hegemony of Zephyr. Lasted about 3 years before they moved on to the Centauri cluster. Then the Crystal Singers of Vega, the Hive Collective of Proxima, the Machine Lords of Kepler 438b. He counted on his fingers. The Iron Brotherhood, the Psionic Conclave, the Stellar Republic, the Void Walkers, the Time Merchants. Time Merchants? General Vextar interjected, unable to contain his curiosity. Oh yes, fascinating group. They showed up in 3 different centuries simultaneously. Bit confusing for our historians, but they taught us some wonderful techniques for temporal cultivation. We grow our own time now, saves on the grocery budget. Tobias chuckled at some private joke. Where was I? Oh yes, after them came the Dimensional Syndicate, the Cosmic Orchestra, the Reality Engineers, and the Probability Pirates. Quite the colorful bunch, that last group. Kratos stared at the human in growing horror. You're lying. No single world could have survived contact with that many advanced civilizations. Survived? Tobias looked puzzled. Oh my. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We didn't just survive. We learned. Each empire that visited us taught us something wonderful. The Corvathians showed us how to manipulate quantum fields. The Crystal Singers taught us to communicate with the fundamental forces of the universe. The Machine Lords helped us understand the marriage of consciousness and technology. As if responding to his words, the space around Earth began to shimmer. What Kratos had initially mistaken for empty space revealed itself to be filled with structures, impossible geometries that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Ships began rising from Earth's surface, but calling them ships was inadequate. They were architectural impossibilities, vessels that appeared to be grown rather than built, their surfaces shifting between solid metal, living tissue, and pure energy. The Dimensional Syndicate taught us about non-Euclidean engineering, Tobias explained helpfully, watching Kratos' expression. Combined with probability pirate phase shifting and reality engineer matter-state manipulation, we've been able to create some truly remarkable vessels. Each one incorporates something we learned from our previous visitors. One of the Earth, ships drifted past the Void Render's viewport. It was simultaneously massive and tiny, ancient and newly born, solid and incorporeal. Looking at it hurt Kratos' eyes and made his mind stretch in directions it wasn't designed to go. What are you? He breathed. Tobias set down his polishing cloth and leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. We're collectors, Supreme Overlord Kratos. Every empire that's come here has brought us gifts, knowledge, technology, philosophy, art. Even the hostile ones taught us valuable lessons about the nature of power and the futility of pure domination. But why? Kratos found himself asking. Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you submit? Why didn't you respond? Because, Tobias said gently, we were learning. Each empire thought they were conquering us, or at least attempting to. But really, they were teaching us. The Corvathians spent 3 years here, convinced they were studying us as primitive specimens. The Crystal Singers believed they were slowly converting us to their harmonic philosophy. The Machine Lords thought they were gradually integrating us into their collective consciousness. The human shopkeeper smiled, and there was something both kind and terrible in that expression. None of them realized that we were the ones doing the collecting. Every technique, every piece of technology, every philosophical insight, every form of art. We absorbed it all, integrated it, made it part of who we are. By the time each empire moved on, convinced they had failed or succeeded according to their own measures, we had become something more than we were before. Kratos looked around his bridge at his officers, seeing his own growing terror reflected in their eyes. And now? Now, Tobias said, picking up his cloth and resuming his polishing. We have a choice to offer you, just like we offered all the others. You can try to conquer us, which won't work but might be entertaining. You can move on to easier targets, which most have chosen to do. Or, he paused, letting the word hang in the air. Or what? Tobias's smile widened. Or you can stay and learn something new. See, Supreme Overlord, we've been collecting from 17 different galactic empires for 60 years. We've gathered quite a lot of knowledge, quite a lot of perspective, and we've recently realized something interesting. The Earthships had begun to form patterns around the Nexarian fleet, not threatening but somehow expectant. Space itself seemed to be listening. "What have you realized?" Kratos asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "We've realized that we're ready for the next phase. We've learned all we can from being students." Tobias set down his cloth and looked directly into the camera, his eyes twinkling with an intelligence that seemed to encompass galaxies. "It's time for us to become teachers." The graduation. The words hung in the cosmic void like a challenge written in starlight. Supreme Overlord Kratos felt something cold and unfamiliar crawling up his spine, something he hadn't experienced since his youth on the war-torn battlefields of Nexar Prime. Fear. "Teachers," he managed to croak, his voice barely audible over the bridge's humming systems. Tobias Henley smiled from his modest shop counter, but the expression no longer seemed entirely human. There was something vast behind his eyes, as if entire civilizations were looking out through those gentle, weathered features. "Oh yes," Tobias said, reaching beneath his counter to retrieve what appeared to be an ancient, leather-bound ledger. "We've been keeping careful records, you understand. Every empire, every lesson, every gift freely given or reluctantly shared. The Corvathians taught us about quantum consciousness, the idea that awareness itself shapes reality. The crystal. Singer showed us how to harmonize with the fundamental vibrations of the universe. As he spoke, the space around the Nexarian fleet began to change. The Earthships weren't just moving in patterns anymore, they were creating something. Threads of light began connecting the vessels, forming a web of pure energy that pulsed with mathematical precision. The Hive Collective," Tobias continued, turning pages in his ledger with careful reverence. "They taught us about unity without uniformity. The Machine Lords showed us how consciousness could transcend flesh. The Time Merchants gave us perspective across centuries, while the Dimensional Syndicate opened our eyes to the infinite layers of existence." General Vextar leaned toward Kratos, his voice a harsh whisper. "My lord, our sensors are detecting massive energy buildups throughout their fleet. Whatever they're doing is not hostile," Tobias interrupted gently, though he shouldn't have been able to hear the conversation. "We learned from the Iron Brotherhood that violence is just incomplete communication. The Psionic Conclave taught us that minds can touch across any distance. We're simply adjusting the conversation." Suddenly, Kratos could feel it. A presence, in his mind, not invasive but undeniably there. It wasn't just Tobias. It was as if the entire planet below was thinking at him, considering him with the patience of geological time and the intensity of stellar fusion. "What are you?" Kratos whispered again, but this time the question carried different weight. Tobias closed his ledger and looked up with infinite kindness. "We're what happens when a species decides that conquest is less interesting than comprehension. You see, Supreme Overlord, every empire that's come here has been operating under the same fundamental assumption, that expansion equals progress, that dominance equals success." The web of light around the Earthships began to pulse faster, and with each pulse, Kratos felt his understanding expand in ways that made his consciousness ache. "But here's what we learned from our 17 teachers," Tobias continued. "Every single empire eventually reaches the same crossroads. They can continue expanding until they consume everything, becoming isolated gods ruling over empty domains. Or, Kratos found himself genuinely curious despite his terror. Or they can discover what lies beyond empire." Tobias stood up from behind his counter, and as he did, his simple shopkeeper's appearance began to shift. Not dramatically, he was still recognizably human. But there was something more now, as if multiple versions of himself from different possibilities were occupying the same space. "Supreme Overlord, may I show you something?" Before Kratos could respond, the bridge around him dissolved. He found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast library, its shelves stretching infinitely in all directions. But these weren't books on the shelves. They were crystallized experiences, bottled memories, compressed civilizations. "This is what we've been building," Tobias said, appearing beside him. "Not an empire of worlds, but an empire of understanding. Every species that's come here has left us something precious, their unique way of perceiving reality. Kratos reached toward one of the crystalline objects and gasped as knowledge flooded through him. In an instant, he experienced the Corvathian understanding of quantum mechanics not as equations but as poetry, felt the crystal singer's harmonic philosophy as physical sensation, understood the machine lord's fusion of consciousness and technology as a form of evolutionary love. Impossible, he breathed. No mind could contain all of this. No single mind, perhaps, Tobias agreed. But we're not single minds anymore. We're a collective consciousness that chose to remain individual, a unity that celebrates diversity. Each lesson we learned from our visitors didn't replace what we were. It added to it. They were back on the bridge now, but everything had changed. Kratos could see his crew not just as physical beings, but as streams of consciousness, each carrying their own fears, dreams, and possibilities. The Nexarian fleet around them appeared fragile and somehow tragic. All that power and technology, devoted to such a limited vision of what existence could be. The really wonderful thing, Tobias said, settling back behind his counter as if cosmic revelations were just part of his daily routine, is that we're not the end of this process. We're just the next step. Next step to what? Tobias gestured toward the Earthships, which had now formed a complex mandala of light and energy around the Nexarian fleet. Each empire that came here was part of a larger pattern. Supreme Overlord, a test, if you will. Not a test administered by us, we were students then, but a test administered by those who came before us in this cosmic curriculum. The space around them shimmered, and suddenly the void was no longer empty. Figures materialized. Beings of such advanced evolution that looking at them directly was like staring into abstract concepts made manifest. They were the Watchers, Kratos realized. Entities so far beyond physical existence that they communicated in pure meaning. Welcome, the beings said, their words arriving not as sound but as direct understanding. You have reached the 18th threshold. 18th? Kratos struggled to comprehend what he was experiencing. Each species that achieves galactic dominance eventually encounters the graduation world, the Watchers explained. Earth has served this function for your region of space-time. 17 empires have been tested here. Some chose continued expansion and were allowed to proceed until they exhausted themselves. Others chose transformation. Tobias nodded as if he'd heard this explanation many times. The Corvathians, Crystal Singers, and Machine Lords, they all chose to evolve beyond empire. They became part of something larger. The others, well, the universe is vast. There's room for everyone to find their own path. And now, Kratos asked, though he was beginning to understand. Now you have the same choice, Tobias said gently. You can continue your conquest, take your fleet to another sector, build your empire until it collapses under its own weight. Many do. It's a perfectly valid path. The Watchers pulsed with something that might have been amusement. Or you can accept graduation to the next level of existence. Your species has learned much about organization, hierarchy, and the application of will. These are valuable lessons that the cosmic community would benefit from. Kratos looked around his bridge at his officers. General Vextar was staring at the Watchers with an expression of religious awe. Communications Officer Zixal had tears streaming down her face. Tears of joy, he realized. Even his normally stoic tactical crew were overwhelmed by the beauty of what they were witnessing. What would happen to us? To the Dominion? Tobias smiled. The same thing that happened to our previous visitors who chose transformation. You would become teachers yourselves. Your understanding of military organization could help younger species defend themselves. Your knowledge of logistics could aid in galactic humanitarian efforts. Your experience with leadership could guide civilizations learning to govern themselves. But we would no longer be us. You would be more than you, the Watchers assured him. Individual consciousness preserved but expanded. Personal identity maintained but enhanced. You would retain everything you are while becoming everything you could be. Kratos felt his certainty crumbling like a sandcastle before a tsunami of possibility. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, everything he had believed about strength and power and the natural order, it was all so small compared to what he was being offered. How long do we have to decide? As long as you need, Tobias said. Time isn't really the constraint here, understanding is. Over the following hours, or perhaps days, time seemed fluid in the presence of the Watchers, members of Krathos's fleet began making individual choices. Some requested transport to Earth to learn more about the transformation process. Others chose to remain with the fleet and continue the Imperial path. There was no judgment, no pressure. Each consciousness was free to choose its own evolution. General Vextar was among the first to request transformation. "My lord," he said to Krathos, "I have spent my life learning to destroy. I would like to learn to create." Communications Officer Zixal chose to stay with the fleet but asked to serve as a liaison between the transformed and those who continued the Imperial path. "Someone needs to keep the communication channels open," she explained. In the end, nearly half the Nexarian fleet chose transformation. They didn't disappear or cease to exist. They became something new while remaining recognizably themselves. Krathos could see them sometimes, existing in the spaces between dimensions, working on projects that spanned galaxies and served purposes he was only beginning to comprehend. As for Krathos himself, he found himself back on Tobias's simple shop counter. The elderly human once again polishing his glass with methodical care. "So," Tobias said pleasantly, "have you decided?" Krathos looked out at his remaining fleet, then at the Earth ships with their impossible geometries, then at the spaces where he could sometimes glimpse the transformed members of his crew working on cosmic projects beyond his current understanding. "I think," he said slowly, "I need to learn more about being a student before I can become a teacher." Tobias beamed. "Excellent choice. We have some wonderful classrooms available. Fair warning, though the curriculum is quite extensive. The time merchants alone will keep you busy for several decades." As the Void Render was gently guided toward Earth by ships that existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously, Krathos realized that his conquest had ended exactly as it was supposed to, not with victory or defeat, but with the discovery that there were questions more interesting than domination. Behind them, space shimmered as another fleet approached from the galactic rim. The 19th Empire had arrived at the graduation world. Tobias sighed contentedly and reached for a fresh cloth. "Busy season," he murmured, and began preparing for the next lesson.